Hi everybody, working on my monochromatic painting. So I'm using this black and white picture and painting with a single color, and I'm using alizarin crimson for that. So I've got a couple of objects kind of on their way. I need to do some more things to this glass over here. But these objects have been painted in a couple different ways. One of them is wet into wet, and I'll show you that in a new object. Wet into wet is putting in a wash, and while that wash is still wet, adding a second one that might be either a different color or a darker version, and letting both wet washes bleed together. The other technique is using layers. That's what I started here in the glass. So I still need to do some more things to the glass, but these have been done in different stages. So I started with a light one, did a slightly darker wash, put that in. But what I'm trying to do everywhere is to keep the little bits of white, right? Those little bits of white that are the reflections or the brightest places in the image, right? So the little rim on top of the glass, the highlights in the egg and the bowl, I want to keep those the white of the paper, right? So anywhere where I can do that, it helps give the illusion of light. Let's do the other egg over here. This one is quite a bit darker. It's kind of back in the shadows. But I'm going to take, again, a little bit of my paint, but mostly water, mixing up kind of a light to medium wash. And I'm going to go ahead and put that kind of light wash all over this egg shape. Some of it is actually kind of almost disappearing into the shadows. While this is still wet, I've got just a little bit of paint in that wash, but I'm going to add a little more to it. So I'm going to go back and mix a little more of the actual paint, the alizarin crimson, using a little less water. And while this is still wet, I'm going to use that wet into wet technique. I'm going to try to get the illusion of a little bit of that shadowing that happens. So you can see, because the first wash that I put on there is still wet, the paint that I'm adding now kind of bleeds into it a little more softly. And I can always shape. I'm blotting my brush a little bit and then kind of shaping that wash around the form of the egg. And I might go ahead and let this dry, even though I want to add just a little more of a darker shadow right in there. If I'm happy with what's happening already, maybe I can let that dry and then do that last part as an addition. Let's go back over to the glass. There are some things over here on the glass on the left side of it that I've left out and need to add those. So let's put in a little bit of this left side of the glass that almost disappears into the dark background. And the surface of I guess it's milk sitting in this glass. The surface of it has a little bit of a definition right here along the top of the surface of the milk. So I'm going to put that in there Just adjust that shape a little bit. And I think there also maybe just a little more of the top rim right along here that should be a little darker. So I can add that as well, thin out the top of the glass just a little bit. And I'm going to come back over to my egg that I just painted because I feel like it needs a little more color. It's starting to fade a little bit on me, so I'm going to add just a little more of my alizarin crimson. I'm going to lay that in there even while it's still wet, so it bleeds in just a little bit. I'm plotting my brush a little bit so that I'm not painting with a lot of color in my brush. I'm just kind of using it as a blender. And there's also a little bit more shadow on that egg over here on the left side too. I think it's being cast from this bowl. So again, taking the paint out of my brush, blotting it a little bit. And I don't want to go over and over and over it too many times because you run the risk of overworking the paper, and that's kind of a hard thing to do in watercolor, or a common thing to do. Couple last things that if I were to paint all of the objects, I've got the board underneath it in the picture that I would need to do. But I also want to think about the idea of stages again, because we mentioned that the glass was painted in stages, letting one thing dry and then going in with the second layer or second wash. I put in a little bit of a background just so that we had the top of the glass visible. We could see that highlight along the top of it. So it might be that I decide that I really want that background to be super nice and dark, because it really is in the photograph. So maybe I want to really add a little more of that paint and the darkness to that background space. So you can make those kinds of choices for your composition, whatever works best for your painting. And again, I might let that kind of fade out a little bit. I want it to be nice and dark behind the glass, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that dark everywhere. And it does continue to be, in the picture anyway, it does continue to be super dark back here behind the bowl. And I kind of like what that does there too. I'm going to leave just a little tiny rim of light along the top edge of that bowl, right? Because you can see that in the picture. So I want to keep that in there. But I might continue that wash all the way across the painting. Right, so I won't take the time to do that while you guys are watching, but maybe that helps the idea of how to start with the idea of layering from light to dark in your image, and also working wet into wet and letting things bleed softly into one another, and then being careful to leave those little rims of light in your painting so that you have that effect of the brightness, the whiteness of the paper coming through in your painting. So everything from white to medium to really heavy, nice and dark versions of your color. And so if I kept going, there would be a lot more darks. Now the picture is pretty dark, so I can get some pretty dark areas and heavy areas of red in the painting as I keep working.